That's really the theme across all of these different areas is, in something like 3 pages of the manifesto, I think I counted 6 new reviews and strategies for big chunky problems: homelessness, child poverty, further education, higher education, pensions, adult social care. There is so much going on here about planning to plan. What do we think are the odds that you do that strategy, you come up with your review, you do careful, detailed, thorough work to say, here's the problem and here's what we need to do about it, and somehow the here's what we need to do about it doesn't come with any price tag attached?
Well, hello and welcome to another election special edition of the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and today we're looking at the Labour Party manifesto. Launched on Thursday, it was, in some ways, a very ambitious manifesto, set out big ambitions for growth, took us through a lot of the problems that the country, in Labour Party's view, is facing, problems with our public services, problems with the welfare system, and set out to fix them. In other ways, it was a remarkably limited manifesto. In terms of specific policy propositions, there was very little there. And if you look at the costings tables at the end of the manifesto, the numbers in terms of additional tax revenues and in terms of additional spending were extraordinarily small. The only significant additional tax revenue was coming from, as with all the other parties, clamping down on tax avoidance. And the only significant spending commitment really was the extra $5 billion a year or so for their green prosperity plan. So relative to the sorts of numbers that we saw in the Conservatives or Liberal Democrats manifesto, it was very small, and certainly by comparison with the nominally huge numbers that we saw in the Green Party manifesto. What Labour did, though, was really focus very much on growth. And indeed, a lot of their policies appeared predicated on managing to get growth off the ground. So here today to talk about all of that, I'm joined by my colleagues, Carl Emerson, Christine Farquharson, and Helen Miller, and we will go through some of those elements of the Labour manifesto. So let's start where I think they would want us to start, actually, which is growth. Very much, as I said, focused on getting the economy growing, and some policies in there which might help. Certainly an ambition to liberalise the planning regime, some suggestion that there will be an industrial strategy of one kind or another. That wasn't clear exactly of what kind, and I hope that the Green Prosperity Plan will help with growth. But let's start with a chat about that. I mean, Carl, what was your take on how much of a plan there was in there to get growth going?
Well, it's certainly a big hope to get more growth, and as you say, that could make a big difference. If the economy grows faster over the next few years, it's much easier to find resources to boost household incomes to spend on public services. And we must all hope that growth does look more like it did in the period up to 2008 than the terrible period we've had since. So hoping for growth, that's not really a strategy. There are lots of things they've set out that might help over the longer term achieve better growth. And there is much that government can do in this space. But the challenge is that if the government does all the right things on growth, has a really concerted effort in numerous areas where economists know that we can do things better, if you do all of that, you execute it well, it's all successful, it will still take a long while to materialise to deliver the sustainable growth that we want. Now, that's not to say that there's no chance that growth will be better than we expect. It could be that we get lucky. It could be that there's just that we just return to something more like what we considered normal in the past. We shouldn't assume that we're going to get lucky. And while the government's completely right to focus on doing policies to help bring about better growth, I think it needs to understand that you have to be patient. It will take time and it won't deliver lots of resources in the next parliament with any kind of guarantee.
I'm kind of optimistic on the potential capacity of governments to make a difference to growth. If we get good governance, if we get planning reform, if we get investment, if we get tax reform, if we take the UK closer to the European Customs Union and single market, all of those things will help. But Helen, did you see anything in there? I mean, one of the things you're obviously keen on and where we know that you can get the economy doing better is tax reform. Anything in there on tax reform?
Not very much. I felt a bit left out yesterday on the tax front. As you said, there weren't very many measures. We heard some things about what they weren't going to do. Maybe we'll come back to that. There's a mention of business rates where they want to get rid of the business rate system and put a new system in place, although they haven't told us what that would look like. I think there's some concern, at least I have. There are things you could do there that would be worse than the current system as well as better. But actually, more broadly, I think, no, we heard very little about tax reform. So I guess you could take that one of two ways. Either that's not their priority and they're going to leave the tax system alone and they're going to do other things, some things Carl mentioned or you mentioned about planning or labour markets, or they are going to do things on tax, but we don't yet know what they are. So there wasn't really very much in the manifesto or not at all. So you're right, we could be thinking about ways to, better align investment incentives or to stop skewing people towards forms of work that aren't the best for them. So, big preferential treatment for capital incomes or self-employment. There are lots of things we could do that would move towards growth, but we didn't hear about them yesterday.
No, indeed. And as you say, the manifesto was pretty silent on what might happen to taxes. Christine, from the spending point of view, particularly from the education point of view, which we know in the long run, and it really is the long run when you're looking at education, can help the economy get going. Anything there?
Bits and pieces there. I think the biggest thing that struck me reading this manifesto was there was an awful lot of diagnosing the problems. And in one sense, that's really welcome. So we heard about problems with the childcare system. We heard about problems with the school system. We heard about teacher burnout. We heard about mental health of young people. We heard about problems in the higher education system. We heard about problems in the further education system. We heard about problems with skills. All of these problems are things, I have a lot of sympathy for. We've been publishing extensively and researching extensively. But diagnosing a problem is pretty different to coming up with a plan to actually do something about that problem. And in the education side, we saw bits and pieces of policy initiatives. We've seen breakfast clubs. We've got more teachers. We've got maybe a little bit more teacher training. So we've got some youth mental health practitioners and mental health hubs. So there are small incremental steps there, which are probably good things to do. They speak to some of the problems that Labour has set out. But it was very striking to look at the contrast between the scale of the challenges that they identified and then the much smaller scale of what they actually concretely proposed to do about that from day one.
So big on diagnosis, big on ambition, but rather limited on actual policy prescription. And Carl, I think that is a pretty good description also of one of the things, I'm not sure it's in their manifesto, but one of the things that the Labour Party announced a week or so ago, which was a desire to get to 80% of people of working age in work, a big commitment, a big ambition, but again, not much in the way of clarity about how we get there. And just to give people a sense of scale there, the UK has never had 80% of the working age population in work. I think there's only 2 or 3 other countries in the world that are there. And when we've had big increases in numbers going into work, it's generally been when we've climbed out of recessions, when we've had a very an unusually high number of people out of work. And whilst the numbers at the moment who are not in the labour market is bigger than it was 5 years ago, it's still considerably smaller than it was 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, and indeed, if you wanted to say, well, name some areas where UK policies or UK outcomes look pretty successful over the last 14 years, I think you'd have to say, well, actually, the UK's employment rate has been really quite high, surprisingly high in some ways. Big fears of lots of unemployment post-financial crisis. Clearly big concerns there'd be lots of unemployment through and after the pandemic. And that, unemployment's a terrible thing. It clearly did rise in the pandemic, but it never reached the kind of levels that we were feared that it might. So the labour market in the sense of generating jobs has been pretty successful. There are clearly, I would say, the 2 really big challenges in this space are firstly about wage progression, people getting more productive and getting pay rises. That's not been happening to the same extent as it did in the past. And I think the second big area of concern has got to be the numbers of working age people who are not in the labour market and are economically inactive, often with a health-related problem, where essentially we didn't hear much from Labour about how they feel about, for example, the rapidly rising benefits bill for those in ill health and what it wants to do about that, whether it's happy to accommodate the costs or whether it wants to carry out some reforms, as the Conservatives have said that they would do.
And that's very striking, isn't it? That was one of the many contrasts between the Conservative manifesto and the Labour one. The Conservatives were very clear about one ambition they have, which is to stop the very, very fast rising benefit bills for people with health problems and Labour really didn't say anything about that in their manifesto. You mentioned this issue of wage progression and so on, Carl, and certainly one of the sort of more interesting parts of the manifesto, it seemed, was some of what it said about labour market regulations. It seemed to be suggesting a slightly new role for the Low Pay Commission. It was talking about extending the minimum wage or the national living wage at the same rate to younger workers, and it was talking about giving more rights to people in work.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we'd have to see what a Labour government would actually do in practice, but I think it does look like this is an area of the manifesto where the proposals are a bit more radical. Extending the minimum wage right the way down to age 18, that's a big deal for those people. They're much more likely to be on low hourly wages. I would suggest it's something that we should be doing very, very carefully to monitor the effects. If a young person's in a low-paid job but getting, for example, good skills and good training, that may well be a very good economic activity for them to be doing. So I think that one has to be done carefully. They want to link the national living wage somehow to the cost of living. We don't know exactly what that means, but it could mean that, further increases in the national living wage would be likely under a Labour government. And then perhaps the bigger part of it is around some of the other regulations where they want to extend employment rights to more employees. At the moment, you have to be in an employment contract for 2 years before you get protection against unfair dismissal. Labour has said that it wants to give employees those rights immediately. Now, obviously, the intention there is to give employees more job security, which doubtless if they could get, they would welcome. Clearly, the concern is that employers might just be a bit nervous about the possibility of hiring someone who turns out not to be a good match for them. And if they know that it would then be harder to terminate that contract, they might be more reluctant to hire. That's the risk that this kind of policy would be taking. That said, I do think that 2 years is quite a long period to allow an employer to make their mind up about someone. I think there clearly is a case for a shorter period than that, but giving the rights immediately might be seen as a bit risky.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think let's hope they approach this reasonably cautiously. It would be good if we could, of course, get to a world in which everyone has more security and that is consistent with good growth. So let's move on to the sort of broad story of the public finances. Carl, when I introduced this, I said the numbers that Labour Party were talking about were very, very small, some very small tax rises. And so outside of a still fairly modest green prosperity plan, some extremely small spending increases. But I suppose that the thing that we didn't get a sense of was, and we've said this about everybody's manifesto, so listener, please don't get too fed up with us repeating this. There was nothing in there, was there, about how Labour in government might address this problem or this apparent commitment on the current numbers to cut public service spending over the next few years, not least because they've committed to precisely the same fiscal target as the Conservatives.
Yeah, I think there's two big picture things missing here from the Labour Party, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats. Firstly, it is just the arithmetic of the numbers they seem to be signing up to, which if you take their pledge on debt seriously, if you take the spending numbers that they've set out to the extent to which they have set them out seriously, it clearly implies under all three of those main UK-wide parties that you'd have to deliver some pretty big cuts that would likely be focused on the day-to-day budgets of what we would describe as unprotected services. So that's areas like prisons and courts, possibly some local government services, possibly further education. So lots of budgets would have to be cut. Cuts vary a little bit between the three parties, depending on exactly what you assume about their plans, but they're sizable. Not as big as what the cuts that the coalition government was delivering in the early 2010s, but clearly cutting now is harder than what it was in the early 2010s. So I think that's the first problem, the arithmetic of do these plans really add up? You haven't told us about how you would keep to what looks like pretty tight spending plans. And I think the second concern, again, this applies to all of them, is, well, this is a plan A, maybe, but what would you do if things turned out for the worst? We should certainly hope that growth is better, but what happens if growth disappoints? What happens if the public finances are not as strong as we think? What would be your instinct? Would it be to tax more? Would it be to spend even less to make those cuts even bigger? Or would it be to borrow more and perhaps push back the date at which debt is scheduled to be on a downwards trajectory? We had no sense of kind of what Sir Keir Starmer would choose to do. For example, were he presented with a worse set of figures from the OBR come the autumn.
Although, to be fair, maybe this is not being fair, but one thing that Dharma was pretty clear about was that there would be no return to austerity, which I took as a commitment not to cut these unprotected departments. And the thing that was puzzling, therefore, was how that will be achieved within the fiscal constraints that they've set themselves, and if there are not going to be any increases in taxes. That's where, as it were, this manifesto doesn't really, well, as indeed none of them really add up, and where the sort of the table of costings at the end, which kind of completely ignores this, again, as the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats completely ignores this issue, doesn't really help us. And that does leave in a world where, as I expect in the autumn, the Office of Budget Responsibility at best doesn't offer any additional growth compared with what it was suggesting in the spring. We are left essentially in the dark as to how Labour would square this particular circle. And they make a lot of the fact that they want to treat investment spending differently from day-to-day spending. But Carl, that's in the current circumstances and given the commitment to get the debt falling in the fifth year of the forecast, I think it's fair to say that at the moment, distinguishing between investment and current spending, given that other fiscal target, actually doesn't make any difference. And indeed, on paper, it's a slightly tighter rule that the Conservatives are following, because the Conservatives have said, well, we're happy to borrow 3% of national income in any year, but we don't actually invest anything like 3% of national income.
Yeah, and the situation at the moment is with a relatively weak growth outlook, with high amounts being spent on debt interest. If you want debt to be falling, and that's what the Conservatives and Labour Party have both said that they want to have happening by the end of the next Parliament, you have to borrow really quite low sums of money. You have to collect more in tax revenue from people than what we're spending on everything other than debt interest. So the debt target, for better or worse, is the really constraining one, and that doesn't distinguish between whether you're accumulating debt because you're spending on day-to-day things, or because you've been cutting taxes, or because you're spending on investment. And actually, on the investment spending side, I think it's worth saying, well, yes, the Green Investment Plan is actually quite a big deal if they do manage to spend an extra £5 billion a year on green investments, given we currently spend about £8 billion a year. That would be a big increase. But non-green investment spending would be cut under the plans that, as far as we can see, Labour would sign up to. So as well as the day-to-day spending plans looking very tight, outside of green investments, I think public sector investment also looks pretty tight for the next few years.
Is there an escape clause here? And we don't want to get too much into the fiscal weeds, but there are different measures, aren't there, of government debt. There's government debt including and excluding Bank of England operations, and the current measure excludes that. Could there be a little bit of fiscal fudging here? And Rachel Reeves, as Chancellor says, yes, I'm committed to this target, but actually it's this target which includes Bank of England operations rather than excludes it. And if she did that, A, would that make life easier? And B, would that be a reasonable thing to do?
Well, you could do that. And if you did it, it would make things a bit easier in the specific debt target falling between what is currently year 4 and year 5. It would be quite temporary as we roll forwards. We don't think it would make such a big difference. And I think also it's worth noting that the reason we target the measure of debt we target at the moment is because it's more affected by decisions made by a Chancellor and less affected by decisions made by the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England. So it does make sense that the government is targeting the measure that they've chosen. I guess more generally, you said that Keir Starmer had said no return to austerity. Of course, he also said that he's committed to this debt rule. He's also said that he's committed to no tax rises on working people. I guess history says that, well, actually, the lesson is you shouldn't be surprised if you do get big tax rises in the first election of a parliament, and often they're ones not detailed in a manifesto. And I think also history tells us that when things get a bit difficult, fiscal rules do get fudged. So, if growth does disappoint, we really shouldn't be surprised if the debt target gets watered down in some way or gets pushed back.
I think the definition of working people might get fudged as well. I think I saw the Wes Streeting had said this morning that by working people, they mean people on low to middle incomes. Well, I think that's not a definition you'd find in the dictionary. That working people can actually be working on quite high incomes. So we might come back to that when we look at whatever tax changes are made. So Helen, let's move on to that issue of tax. You pretty thin gruel in terms of tax changes actually in the manifesto, I think it's fair to say.
They're only penciling in about £7 billion a year of permanent tax increases. And as you said at the top, most of that is coming from cracking down on avoidance. I mean, a quick side note for the people out there who are sort of nerds like us. Remarkably, they only mentioned avoidance in their manifesto and not avoidance and evasion. Now, they may just have done that for marketing purposes. Maybe they actually do mean avoidance and evasion. If they really only mean avoidance, so the legal stuff, I think it will be even harder to get in $5 billion than it would be if you're cracking down on evasion and avoidance. But anyway, that's the big thing they're going to go for. The other measures, I mean, there's VAT on private schools, there's higher taxes on private equity bosses. For the people who are hit by those taxes, they're going to be, a substantial deal. You'll feel them. In private equity, to give you an example, there's only about 3,000 people in the country who get carried interest. So a tax increase on a small number of people. But in the big public finances sense, these are all small measures. They're not going to touch the sides of any of the problems that Carl or Christine were highlighting. So yeah, small. I think we heard more about, I guess, was what they're not going to do. So they've said they're not going to increase VAT, no increases to national insurance. A very carefully worded, they're not going to increase the basic, higher or additional rates of income tax. So leaving themselves some scope to do some things there. I think that's a good thing. We've said in the past that whether you want to put up taxes or take taxes down, these kind of tax locks are a problem. They tie your hands before you know what kind of problems you're going to face in the future. So I think the more loosely worded they are, the better. But to be clear, on income tax, they could raise, for example, rates on dividends. They could change how we do pensions tax relief in various different ways. So some wiggle room there, but still ruling out big changes to our big three taxes. Also saying no increase in the main rate of corporation tax. So, in fact, the question I've been asked most by journalists this week, I think, is what could they do? So, to recap what we've just said, they basically have to do one of three things. They're going to have to change their fiscal rules, cut spending, or increase taxes. And they've left voters guessing which of those three things they're going to do. We don't really know. I think a lot of people are sceptical about the idea that the Labour government would come in and make big spending cuts for the reason you point out, Paul, that Keir Starmer said he didn't want a return to austerity. So what I keep getting asked is, well, what would they do on tax actually? And of course, the answer is I don't know because they haven't told us. But if they did want to raise more money, they could start looking at capital gains tax, more broadly than just the private equity measure I mentioned. I think if they just fiddle around with rates, they're going to struggle to get anything like chunky sums of money, partly because there are lots of different rates of capital gains and there are things like no tax on capital gains that are left at death. So if you just move one rate, you get people switching income across different things. I think if they're going to be bold, and I'd urge them to be bold in this regard, and do a proper reform of capital gains tax, change the definition of the tax base, do a more fuller set of reforms, there could be some money on the table there, but they haven't told us about that. Of course, there are other taxes. There are, reliefs in inheritance tax that I think would be, up for getting rid of. There's council tax, which needs a good look at. And I think to their credit, they didn't rule out more things. I mean, the Conservatives, as we talked about last week, had a bucket list of all the things they wouldn't do to the tax system. I mean, I think at least Labour didn't rule out more stuff. So there would be scope to do things. But I think we're left guessing as to what they would actually do. And as Carl just said, most governments, at least in recent history, when they come into power, do find big chunky tax increases they didn't tell us about in the manifesto. So I think everyone will be looking at, if a Labour government comes to power, where will they be looking to find the money in order to not have that return to austerity that they've said they don't want?
But just give us a sense, Helen, because I don't actually really have a sense. I mean, even on the best scenario with a fair wind and an effective set of changes, if you were saying, well, let's look at the taxes that you just mentioned, particularly capital gains tax and inheritance tax, and try and sort them out and make them work a bit better. I mean, how much money is there? I mean, it's not much, is there?
Well, the honest answer is we don't really know, because if you just put up current rates, then on the official estimates, you raise very little. Sometimes you can end up losing money on official estimates because you're worried that people are going to respond. My sort of educated view guess is that if you do something substantial, by which I really do mean, reintroduce indexation allowances within capital gains, stop the uplift of capital gains at death, so don't let people avoid taxes by dying. change a whole bunch of rates, so not just the main rate of capital gains, but also the relief for business owners, do a package of measures, then I think you get something chunky in the billions, maybe up there with around the 10. But what I've just said is actually would be a big change. But to give you a sense of scale, if you're a higher rate, an additional rate taxpayer at the moment, you're paying your 45p of income tax, your 2p of national insurance, and your income is subject to, employer national insurance of 13.8. If you're a business owner and you can take your income in the form of capital gains, then you'll have paid your corporation tax, and then you'll pay capital gains at 10%. There's just a huge difference in the tax rate. If you could really start to make that up without people, trying to avoid that, then I think there is real money on the table. But we're not talking, an easy 20 billion here. I think we're talking a kind of a difficult, maybe high single digits number is where we're thinking that government could get with a lot of reform. So, I think worth going after it. And actually, even if they're not going to get any extra money, I think we should be reforming how we do capital gains tax, because it discourages investment more than it needs to. But I don't think there's an easy kind of like big number you could just go pick up.
Yeah, no, very, very, very striking, very interesting. And as you say, would take a serious bit of reform. And I think that's the sort of thing where they really would need to work this out in detail, present it, and then do it immediately so that people aren't avoiding changes. So we, dear listener, are as much in the dark as you as to whether Labour Party does have any substantial plans on any of these taxes, but they've certainly tied their hands on quite a lot of the big ones. Well, in a way, the most fascinating sentence I read in the manifesto, Helen, and you alluded to this in your introductory remarks, was we're going to abolish business rates and replace them with something better. And that's pretty much as far as it went, which is a pretty remarkable statement. I mean, business rates raise, 30 billion or so a year, maybe a bit less than that, but yeah, a pretty chunky tax to commit to getting rid of them and give us no clue as to what they've replaced them with, I thought was slightly odd.
Yeah, well, actually, they give us a little bit of a clue. It makes me nervous, frankly. So business rates is the tax that businesses pay on the properties that they occupy. And it is a problematic tax because to the extent that it is levied on business properties, it discourages businesses from using properties and developing them. And that's not a good thing to be doing. And we've long said that you want to stop doing that. So in some sense, I very much welcome that let's do something different. What makes me very nervous is that they speak about the problem being there's an unlevel playing field between online retailers and the high street. We need to, get that sorted out and basically push tax towards online retailers. And that's where I think actually the diagnosis of the problem is wrong. So business rates is a problematic tax, but not for that reason. It's not killing the high street. I mean, I think the best way to see that is to think that most of the value of a business property is the land it sits on, not the actual building. The reason that buildings are worth more in London than in Hastings is not because the buildings are better in London necessarily, it's because that they're in London. So most of that tax actually is ultimately going to be felt by landlords, and it's not skewing the market towards big warehouses and away from high street stuff. So I think the danger is if you do put a tax in place, and again we don't know what it's going to be, but if you put a tax in place that ended up having higher taxes on warehouse or online retailers than you have on the high street, you wouldn't be offsetting a problem, you'd be creating a new problem and putting a bias into the market. I think it's also, again, stepping back, very striking that for decades, business rates was really boring, really stable, nothing happened, the tax did not change. In the last 14 years, it's changed loads. We've had loads of temporary reliefs and fiddling with the system. So we do need to stop fiddling, get a plan, decide on a new system, implement new system and leave it alone. I just hope if they're going to grasp that problem, what they do is implement a new system that we want to leave alone for the next 10 years and not one that actually makes some problems worse. And we have to sit there thinking, oh God, we've got this horrible system. Now we've got to keep trying to find it, make it better. So it is the one area where they've said they want to do tax reform. So good. But there's definitely, as I said at the top, things they could do that would make it worse and not better. So they have to be very careful if you're going to replace such a chunky tax that you put something better in its place.
Yeah. It's very interesting. It's very interesting to decide what to make of this. And it's really in line with a lot of the manifesto, sort of big signals of change, big, often correct diagnosis of problems, quite a lot of statements about having reviews, quite a lot of statements about developing plans, but very little actually across the board in terms of specifics of policy. So let's move on now to some of the spending plans. And again, some areas where there are sort of broad statements of wanting change, but very little in the way of detail. So Christine, just to sort of clear it out of the way, because these really are tiny things. I mean, what did we learn in terms of the specific spending commitments?
So basically, the specific spending commitments come largely in two areas, in health and in education. On the education side, we've talked about some of the biggest ones, around 6,500 new teachers. Where those are going to come from, we're not sure, but there's some money there for them. We've talked about breakfast clubs for primary school pupils in England, and we've talked about youth mental health and these hubs and bringing mental health practitioners into schools. Taken together, that comes to about £1 billion. So it's not nothing, but in the context of a school's budget of around 40 billion, it's not, transformational. And actually, quite strikingly on that school's budget was what Labour didn't say. So they refrained from saying anything at all about what they wanted to do with core schools funding. The Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, both of those parties, promised to protect per pupil funding in real terms. Labour said nothing at all. So we really genuinely don't know what the plan is, what's baked in terms of core school funding. On the health side, we saw slightly bigger spending commitments. There's a lot in there about CT scanners, MRI scanners. There's a lot in there about funding sort of many tens of thousands of new appointments, many dentistry appointments. So there are some spending commitments there. It works out to about just under £2 billion a year by 2028. Set that against the £192 billion that we currently spend on the NHS, and we're at something a little bit less than 1% of the total NHS budget. So again, that's not nothing. I'm sure the NHS will be happy to have some of that money, but the much bigger question is what you are going to do about things that Labour has signed up to, like the NHS workforce plan, but not necessarily given us any indication of whether they're going to fund that, how they are going to fund that, or what that would mean for other areas of public services. So really the big decisions in this manifesto were things that definitely didn't appear on that scoring table, that costings table at the end of the document.
Bit of a theme, isn't it, that we are being left in the dark on a lot of things. I mean, it was very striking on health that, as you say, they committed to the workforce plan, which for people who aren't familiar with this is something I have described once or twice as arguably the biggest fiscal announcement of my lifetime outside of crises. It's essentially, I think, committing the government to an additional 50 plus billion of spending on the NHS within a bit more than a decade, and a huge increase in the size of the NHS workforce. So big increases every year. But the other thing that's very striking about what they've said on health is that they want to get, and we all want to get it, don't we? They want to get to a position where nobody's waiting more than 18 weeks for an appointment, from a world at the moment where I think nearly half of people are waiting more than 18 weeks for an appointment. And getting to that, the last Labour government achieved it, but they achieved it after 7 years and with 7% per year real increases in health spending. So big challenging ambitions without much sense of how we would get there. And on education, again, we had this sort of broad brush, there's a problem, we'll do something, but we're not going to tell you what. So if we look at higher education, my recollection, Christine, is the manifesto says something like, we will work to make the higher education funding system fairer, or something as bland as that. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's pretty much the long and short of it. I think we had something like one sentence on higher education saying the system is terrible and we'll do something better with it. What that is
better than doing something worse, I guess.
I think you heard it here first. IFS thinks that doing something better is better than doing something worse. So that's great. And I think that's really the theme across all of these different areas is, in something like 3 pages of the manifesto, I think I counted 6 new reviews and strategies for big chunky problems: homelessness, child poverty, further education, higher education, pensions, adult social care. There is so much going on here about planning to plan. What do we think are the odds that you do that strategy, you come up with your review, you do careful, detailed, thorough work to say, here's the problem and here's what we need to do about it, and somehow the here's what we need to do about it doesn't come with any price tag attached? Because that's what Carl was setting out earlier. That's what that means when you're in this tight fiscal environment and you're not giving an indication of whether you are going to put up taxes or increase borrowing, and you're pledging to stick with the spending commitments that we have now. What that means is you are not giving yourself any space at all, or you're certainly not telling people what you would do to pay for the price tag that's going to come for some of these reviews and strategies. And so I think there's a lot of ambition here. And if everything in this manifesto, all of these targets and plans and hopes were achieved, the UK would be a far better country than it is right now. That would be amazing. But I think what we're missing is all of the steps that we're going to need to take to get there and all of the money that we're going to need to finance those steps.
Yeah, and that's very much my take on the manifesto as well. And in one sense, we shouldn't be too grumpy about that. I think it's better to say effectively, look, we know what's wrong. We've got a diagnosis, and let's put our hands up. We don't know because we've been in opposition and we haven't had access to the civil service, and our resources are limited. We don't know exactly what we're going to do. So we are promising to think really hard about this and try and get it right. So I don't want us to be too grumpy about it, but I also don't think we should give Labour a pass on it either. I think what they're really asking the electorate to do is trust us. Trust us, we will be sensible. And let's hope they will be sensible. But it would also be nice just to have that sense, just a little bit clearer sense of, are you serious about not putting taxes up? Will you actually be looking to find some extra money for these public services? Is there any kind of underlying philosophy other than being sensible? Being sensible is a great philosophy in terms of how you're going to achieve this. And I suppose the big political conundrum for them, assuming they win the election, and that's not a political statement, I think anyone looking at the polls will assume that they're going to win the election. I guess the big political conundrum facing them is, will they have a year or 2 years to really, really go through all of these issues, review them, not do anything very much on them initially, and then come back with policies? Or will they feel under very, very intense pressure to come up with answers on higher education, social care, pensions, homelessness, the welfare system, and so on within the first 6 months? And if they do, and I don't know the answer to this, if they do, are they actually much further along the road to working out the answers than they have revealed in the manifesto? In which case, it would have been nice to know. Or are they really as far back as the manifesto suggests? In which case, finding the answers within 6 months is going to be a real struggle. I think let's leave our audience on those tenterhooks of ignorance. Tenterhooks of ignorance. Is that a phrase? Anyway, if it is, I've just coined it. If it's not, I've just coined it. We I think are from the last half hour or so that we've been discussing this, I think our collective view on the Labour manifesto is, yes, we need to go for growth. Yes, there are a small number of interesting ideas there about how to achieve it, changing the planning system and so on. But there are some big gaps there, even where there's something mentioned like the planning system, lots and lots of work to do to work out how to do it. No indication of things like what you might do to reform the tax system. No serious increase in investment. Certainly no sign that they want to, for example, rejoin the customs union. So lots of the elements of what you might think of a technocratic growth strategy, not quite there. Really didn't give us much of a clue as to how they will deal with the big public finance problems that they've got, and also not really giving us much of a clue on how they will go about reforming or changing so many of those areas that they possibly appropriately diagnose as being problematic at the moment. So thank you to Helen, thank you to Christine, thank you to Carl. Thank you to everyone who's been listening. Do come and look at our work by visiting www.ifs.org.uk. And to further support us, please do consider becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. All of that money really does help us to find the space and time to do this kind of work. You can find out more in the episode description. We will see you next time.